Okay.
So I'm Lee White, at the time with George K. Baum, still am, and we're the investment bankers. We helped create the plan of finance to finance the stadium on behalf of the stadium district. We worked with the legislative drafting office, one of the chief sponsors, Kathy and Terry, to create the plan of finance to make sure that the 10th of 1 cent sales tax over 20 years would generate enough revenue to pay off about $100 million of sales tax revenue bonds in order to build the facility. And that's the plan of finance that we worked with. We were retained by the baseball stadium district, I think in 1990-ish or 91. I think it was 1990. And we're the investment banking firm that worked with I just blanked on the name, the executive director of the baseball stadium district, who's now at Forest City.
Tom Gleason.
No, Tom was the director of public relations, governmental relations.
Ray Baker.
No, and Ray was a chairman.
John McHale.
No, it was John. I'll think of it. But there was an executive director who John McHale hired. John was a chairman of the baseball stadium district. He hired.
Was it Lehigh?
John Lehigh, thank you.
Yes.
John Lehigh was the executive director, and so we worked with John and his staff to actually execute the plan of finance, and the hope was that we could raise $100 million of sales tax revenue bonds to build the stadium, and pay it off in 20 years. And in point of fact, we had very conservative revenue projections for in 1990, like 3% a year of revenue growth, and the 1990s were a boom year. We had 6 and 7% sales tax growth year after year after year. And so the bonds were paid off 10 years early. They were paid off actually in 2001, which was what allowed the Broncos and Pat Boland to go back to the legislature and create the football stadium district and use the second 10 years of that sales tax revenue stream to pay for the football stadium. So we got basically 2 stadiums for the price of one, though we didn't know it when you carried the bill in 1990 or whatever. You got the legislation approved. One anecdote that people don't realize is that the stadium's costs were growing, escalating, particularly at the end of the construction schedule in 1993 and 1994. And John Lehigh called me and said, I think we're going to be short 10, 11, or 12, $13 million. We really don't want to go back to having another sales tax revenue bond. It would be awkward, maybe, to say to the public that we had to come up with that money. And they would say whether we want the Rockies to pay for it, etc. And that would be problematic in terms of their lease negotiations. So he said, give me an idea of how to come up with, I think it was $12 million. And so George K. Baum and Company proposed a leasing company, and I was the president of the GKB Stadium Leasing Corp. And we bought all the seats, the escalators, and the elevators with our capital from the manufacturer of that equipment. And our leasing company owned that for 3 years, and we leased it to the stadium.
Wow, I had no idea.
It was publicly done, but it wasn't well advertised.
Right.
And so actually I was the president of a company that owned every seat in Coors Field. In fact, I have 2 of them at home that I was given by the stadium.
Isn't that something?
That's great.
And that was just to kind of get by that gap in funding until the facility was occupied and doing well. And very quickly, a couple years after the stadium opened in 95, I think was the first thing, then the stadium district repaid us for that, and then they purchased that equipment from us. So, but we owned that equipment during that period of time, so it was kind of funny. I always joked with the Momforts that if they didn't make their lease payments or continue to play there, I'd take a socket wrench and I would take out every seat and I would start with theirs. And that way we compelled them to continue to play baseball. Another anecdote is that I think I had an inkling that we were going to get awarded a stadium, get awarded the national team, probably before anybody else. And that's because in the summer of when they were making their final, the National League was making their final decision, I, with Jack Spurley and Craig Umball, were down in Scottsdale watching some March spring training games. And we went to a San Francisco Giants game, and there, who sat right down in front of us, was the commissioner of baseball, who I think was Bart Giametti at the time. And I took my little baseball that I had with me. I think I'd gotten a foul ball or something. And I went up to him and I said, Mr. Commissioner, I'm Lee White, working for the baseball stadium district in Denver. Would you sign my ball? And by the way, do you think we're going to get a team? And he said, well, I can't officially comment on that, but I think you're going to be very, very happy. So I think I was the first person that knew we were going to get a team because of that little exchange with the commissioner of baseball just a few months before the team was announced. And I have one other just personal funny anecdote. When the model for the stadium was unveiled, and John McHale had a big press conference and with the architects from Kansas City, and it was a beautiful stadium design. And I was there along with lots of other people, as I'm sure you were there as well. I had my 5-year-old son Tim with me, and the press conference is over, and they're getting ready to take some pictures of John McHale and the section, the model of the stadium. And John and I kind of eyeballed each other, and I put my son Tim right up next to that model of the stadium, and John started showing Tim where Tim would just be seated as a baseball fan. And a Denver Post photographer snapped that photo, and that appeared next day on the front page of the Denver Post, with this young baseball fan looking into the stadium model and saying, gosh, what's going on? And John McHale pointing out what a beautiful stadium and how much he and all future generations would enjoy it. And that was a memento that we clipped that out, of course, in the Post and treasured that. It was a very easy project to finance, to be honest with you. The sales tax revenue stream was a very solid rate of revenue stream. It got an A rating from Standard & Poor's and Moody's. We got bond insurance from NBIA, a AAA bond insurer. The $100 million of bonds sold out in just a few hours the day that they were offered to the public, because the revenue stream had been well tested because it coincided with the RTD district. So it was well thought out by the legislature to be, well, revenues can go up and down. There had been a history for many years of that revenue stream that supported the regional transit district, and the baseball stadium district was basically contiguous with that district. So from an investment banking perspective, it was an easy deal to get rated. The plan of finance was not heroic. It was a conservative plan of finance, and the bonds were snapped up right away. And we were able to have a diversified set of investors at what was then a very, very low and attractive interest rate. And as I said earlier, the great benefit was that in that following decade, the revenues were so robust that the bondholders got paid off 10 years earlier than we thought they would be paid off, actually to their chagrin, because they wanted to hold those coupons for a long time, for 20 years. And they got the bonds taken away from them after only 10 years. So the plan of finance actually worked just fine on behalf of
Do you remember what the interest rate was then?
I don't. Interest rates were much higher in the early 90s than they were now. I'm guessing it was in the mid-5s or 6% for a 20-year bond issue. And then we actually did refund those bonds a few years later because interest rates came down in the early 90s, and so we were able to achieve some interest rate savings and lower the debt service cost, which actually helped the prepayment as well from the district. I do remember also negotiating on behalf of helping the district negotiate with the team for the lease of the facility. And the stadium district, I thought, did a really remarkable job in making sure that the public was protected in that negotiation, and that any cost, once the team was in the facility, would be paid by the team and not borne by the taxpayers. And indeed, that happened with the additions. You know, remember, we added some extra seats in the outfield. I think that's how the bleachers came to be.
Right field.
In the right field, exactly, because of the tremendous attendance during the '93 and '94 seasons at the old Bronco Stadium. And so they said, boy, we're going to set some attendance marks, and indeed they did. Attendance at the facility well surpassed the expectation. I remember Ford Frick at BBC did a projection of attendance on behalf of the stadium district, and they just blew right past all of that. And then, of course, as we all know, so the naysayers said that this would never help redevelop a downtown blighted area. And apparently there was some magnetism and some charisma to that stadium because Lodo's a pretty happily placed now, and it really benefited the community in many powerful ways beyond just the baseball community. So that was wonderful.
So I have a couple of questions for you, and because the Colorado legislature was controlled by the Republicans in the House and the Senate, and we did have a Democrat governor at that time. Trying to get any tax-related issue was very, very difficult. And of course, that's when Neil and I decided that the structure needed to be, we would not commit until we were awarded a team.
Exactly.
But the other kind of complication within the legislature when you're carrying a tax bill, or well, any kind of bill, is that if it has any fiscal note on it, which means if it's going to if the bill itself is going to have any cost, then it's probably not going to pass, or it's going to be in trouble. So one of the things that we had to do in the legislation was create this stadium authority and a baseball commission, but there was no funding to support either of those entities.
Right.
And I know some private firms came to the front and kind of upfronted that. Was George K. Baum one of those?
We were hired, obviously, before an award was made, and we, in our presentation and our review, and then ultimately our engagement agreement with the Stadium District, worked on the come. So we were doing sweat equity on the expectation that we would be awarded the national team, but no guarantee of that. And so we were at risk as an organization, so we were kind of pitching in, if you will. Now, we obviously had the opportunity to sell bonds, so that if we won, if it worked out, but if it didn't, we were just,
it was a public relations exercise.
Exactly. It was a gigantic, well, it was just, it was a commitment to the community, obviously, like so many other organizations participated in. I think the other thing that you know better than I do, Kathy, but I think the other element that the legislature, that helped the legislation pass was the vote of the community. That the legislature wasn't imposing the tax. This is pre-Tabor, so you, I think, had a legal ability to do so. If you had the legislature wanted to impose a tax, you didn't have to hold a vote, but you realized that a vote of the people in the RTD district would have to vote on that, and that set up the election, of course.
I don't think we would have gotten the legislation through if we didn't have the vote component in it.
Exactly.
The legislature wouldn't have voted for it. So how long were you, when you first were contacted, to when the bonds were?
I think it was a year and a half.
Year and a half?
Yeah, I think it was a year and a half. We were hired in the summer, I think, of 1990. I think the bonds were sold late 1991 is when we did the first financing. So it was about a year and a half. And the reason is that the design and construction work had to be, not the construction, the design and estimating work, we needed to know how much the stadium was going to cost in order before you, so you knew how many bonds to offer for the purposes of the project, funding the project funding properly. So it was quite a long time that we had to wait to offer the debt and hoping that interest rates would be favorable in the meantime.
Well, I think another thing that maybe a lot of the public, especially newer folks and younger folks, don't know or understand is that at that time, number one, Colorado was in a pretty deep recession.
Right.
That we had a couple of other things going on. We were looking at building an airport, a convention center, Denver Public Library, these kinds of things during a recessionary period. We didn't know for sure in the very beginning if Major League Baseball was really going to expand. Tim Wirth and Dan Schaefer were holding some antitrust hearings trying to get some movement happening. Once we did know that they would expand by 2 teams, at that time it seemed as if there was a lot of competition, a lot of cities raising their hand, saying that they'd like to be a part of that, but we had no idea what the criteria would be. Major League Baseball would not put anything in writing. We didn't know what the franchise fee was going to be. We didn't know what the stadium would ultimately cost. So we were doing a lot of our best guess and estimating, and that's where I think the George K. Baums of the world really helped us.
Thank you.
I mean, in terms of trying to figure out what's a reasonable idea that a stadium's gonna cost, how many years is it gonna, do we need to put a sales tax in place in order to get those paid was a big deal.
We all had to make conservative assumptions on the circumstances. You're right. The early part of the decade was difficult financially for the country and the state, but we didn't foresee that shortly thereafter the economy from '94 to 2000 was just roaring.
It was a boom.
It was really a fantastic boom, uninterrupted 6 or 7 years of sales tax growth, but we didn't foresee that at the time. And I think also, and both of you were more involved in this than I was, that there was some need for some additional resources, and I think the deal with Coors was cut at the time, the naming rights deal, which brought their cash to the table to help augment the funds to build the stadium at the time.
Well, there were 3 other provisions that we ended up putting in the bill, you know, besides the ones that I've mentioned to you before about, you know, we aren't going to build a stadium until we have a commitment that we would be awarded a team. But one of the other parts was that the tax would go away once the debt was retired. But the other was that there was this target of privatization, which was, you know, and did we end up on a 40% number? And we decided to put it as a target, not a hard and fast, that they would sell the naming rights, the parking, and the advertising in order to get that done. But then the other piece was that I kept hearing over and over, especially from Adams County, who felt they'd been screwed over by Denver, was the fact that, okay, here it is, the metro area is going to pay for it, and Denver is going to be the sole beneficiary of this. And so we had decided that we needed to allow the suburban cities and counties to put in a bid for having the location in their community, but that there would be revenue sharing within that. Did that revenue sharing piece affect the finance plan and what you guys had to do?
It did not, because the it was possible to finance the sales tax revenue bonds solely on the basis of the sales taxes that were expected within the RTD district. And as you point out, those other potential revenue streams were uncertain at the time, TBD, and we couldn't base a plan of finance and get the good rating that we wanted, and therefore the low interest rate, on the basis of promises by the private sector to participate. And we didn't know how much advertising revenue there would be, et cetera. At the time we started to build the stadium and finance it in '91 versus when it opened in '95. And so we worked solely on the basis of the sales tax revenue stream, which is well understood to the capital markets. And that was the basis. And any of the additional revenues would be icing on the cake. And some of those revenue streams, as for example, the Coors Field naming rights, did eventually come to pass and did benefit and helped the stadium district and therefore the 6 counties. But the plan of finance, we didn't feel could rest on those hoped-for revenue streams. We had to base it upon a proven sales tax revenue stream. And so it was completely unrelated, even to the success of the team. Whether customers showed up, fans, for $1.5 million or $3 million was irrelevant to us, because how many people walked into the gate wasn't a factor in paying back the debt.
So how important was the lease and what was said in the lease to the finance plan?
Good question. Yeah, we needed to prove to the capital markets that the lease that would be in effect a triple net lease, in the sense that the team would pay all the operating cost of the facility, so that the stadium wouldn't be abandoned or maintained or lit or fixed up. And so that was why the lease negotiations with the team were important, to make sure that there would be no residual liability to the taxpayer for a facility that wasn't maintained or used properly.
So you were linked into those negotiations?
I was was asked to advise the negotiating team on that part of it. What do the capital markets need to see in the lease so that we can be successful on the debt financing side? That's correct.
So the other piece of this too, that I alluded to just a little bit earlier, is because we had these other capital projects going on. I know that Dave Hurlinger, who at that time was the administrator, executive director with CHAFA, and who administered the private activity bond allocation, had indicated, you know, maybe we've got to meet with now some cities and counties over, are we going to have enough private activity bond allocation? How do you feel that played into the scenario?
It worked out really, really well. We ended up not having any issues with the need to finance the stadium. Dave, as you pointed out, realized the value of that part of the town earlier by moving Colorado Housing Finance Authority's headquarters from the Mallow building next to the mansion to the building catty corner from the T. Years before anybody else realized that would be a hot place to do it. So he was very instrumental in kind of pointing the way. And as you remember, with regard to this location of the stadium, there were several sites offered up. One out near what was then the Stapleton Airport, and Shoes offered the Platte River where Nichols Arena now sits. Pepsi rented the center now sits. And there was one other location that I forgot. But in the end, the location in the abandoned train yards is the one that won out for reasons of cost, etc. I do believe, and you would remember this better than I, there was one holdout, and I think it was the Copperthwaite family that owned their gas station at the corner of 20th and Blake. that impeded for a while the negotiations.
Right. That's because the stadium district didn't have any power of condemnation.
Exactly. So in the end, a resolution was solved. So I'm not blaming the Copperthwaites. It was they were seeking their best interest, and they had a key piece of land. But in the end, it all worked out. But it was harrowing at the time to figure out how to get hold of that last little abandoned piece of land.
Well, and talking about having to go back and tweak some things within the statute, Terry Considine, who was the Senate sponsor, who was in real estate like myself, didn't believe that wholeheartedly in eminent domain, and so that was taken out in the Senate and ultimately.
So it was in your bill, it was in the House bill?
Yes, it was in the House bill. And so then, once the problem arose, then I think it was more incumbent upon the legislature to go back and say, and put eminent domain back into the scenario. What was the other thing I was going to say? Oh, and so one of the other things that we ended up needing to change, it seemed like baseball, you know, was dragging their feet, and of course we had put this in the legislation on the ballot for the November election. And then all of a sudden baseball accelerated its process, and we're going to make a decision before the general election. And so we had to put it on the primary election ballot.
It was an August vote, I believe.
Yes. So did that create any impact or
no,
for
it
you
didn't.
guys?
No, we knew that we couldn't successfully sell the bonds. In fact, the legislation precluded us from selling any debt until we had two key approvals. One, the approval of the National Electoral Board team, and B, the vote of the district. And so we were kind of on pins and needles like everybody else, hoping that both would occur roughly with coterminous, which indeed they ended up doing. But it wasn't build it and they will come. It was, if they come, then we will build it. So there was no liability potential to the sales tax.
So one of the other obstacles I think that we faced, or hand-wringing that we faced on this, was the polls were showing that if this was on the ballot, there was a chance this was not going to pass. And so were you all privy to those polls, and how were you feeling? Were you feeling comfortable, not comfortable?
I was feeling as nervous as everybody else, and so I walked precincts, and this is pre-email, so you mailed your friends or called your friends to get them to vote. But it was a harrowing night for us all, hoping that it would pass. Governor Roman was the governor at the time, is that right? Just finishing his term, I believe.
Yes.
And so he campaigned well for it. Ray Baker at the Stadium District. Sam Simplizio and all the people on the advisory committee were very big supporters. And so it was an all hands on deck political campaign to convince the public, when times weren't that great in the sales, people didn't want their taxes to go up, that this was an investment. Mayor Pena, as you pointed out, Neil, was going to build their way out of the recession through these major capital investments. And the citizens of Denver basically approved all of those things, every one of the ballots. And the baseball stadium district vote passed in Denver, I think, pretty handily. And those reinvestments for DIA and light rail and all those other things ultimately turned out to be foresighted, though at the time it was perilous.
Well, and going back to the election, and I'm wondering if this had any impact or made any of the investors on the bonds nervous, and that is, after the election, and the issue had passed in all of the counties except for Adams County.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a lawsuit that was brought by some individuals in Adams County saying, you know, that we don't have to pay the tax because we didn't vote for it. I mean, the court certainly found in favor that, yes, you do have to pay for it, but did it create any problems on the financing side?
Yeah, I had forgotten that aspect, and I believe we worked with our bond counsel to assess the merits of that suit. I don't think the suit was settled by the time we issued the debt. I don't recall exactly, but I'm pretty sure our bond counsel concluded that the suit was frivolous and without merit, and that we would prevail, and therefore gave us a clean opinion as to the enforceability of the tax in the entire stadium district, which allowed us to sell the bonds. I think we disclosed the Adams County taxpayer complaint to bond investors, but said we believed it was without merit. That's my recollection. It could have gummed it up, but we had courageous bond counsel who saw the law quite differently.
Saw it correctly, yes.
Well, and I think it goes back to what Neil was saying before. I mean, we really feel like this was a relay race, and that if everybody wouldn't have been able to do their piece well, we probably wouldn't have baseball.
Right. Well, it started with the legislature, in my view, because it really does. Without having a stadium district, it was just wasn't going to happen. And I'm happy that you and your colleagues did the right thing. So, kudos to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was very enjoyable. What a trip down a nice piece of our collective history.
Well, and I think it will be very enjoyable for the people who did participate and who deserve a lot of credit to see what some